The auctioneer almost skipped her bid. He had been calling numbers for 3 hours straight under a February sky the color of old pewter, and when the woman in the brown canvas work coat raised her hand for lot 47, he hesitated. Just half a second. The way a man hesitates when he sees something that doesn't quite fit the picture he has in his head. Lot 47 was a 1954 grain dryer, or what was left of one. The burner assembly had been stripped out years ago for parts. The auger was seized. One of the legs had been welded back on crooked, and whoever did the welding hadn't been having a good day. The farm equipment dealer, standing beside the fence post, had already walked past it twice without stopping. 2 teenagers had taken a picture of it as a joke. The opening bid was $40. Naomi Ellsworth paid $65. The men near the coffee urn exchanged a look. Not a cruel look. More the look of people watching someone make a mistake they have no way of stopping. The farm equipment dealer shook his head once. Slowly, the way a doctor does when the diagnosis is obvious. Someone murmured something about the Ellsworth place, about how the late George Ellsworth had always had a head for machinery, the implication being that the head for machinery had not passed to his widow. Naomi wrote the check without looking up, but it was a dry July. She had driven 40 minutes in the dark that morning to be here before the gates opened. She had walked the entire auction yard twice before the bidding started. She had crouched down beside lot 47 with a flashlight and a measuring tape while her breath made small clouds in the cold air. She knew exactly what she had bought, what she put inside it 3 months later, changed how her family farmed for the next 22 years. The Ellsworth farm sat 11 kilometers northeast of Vermilion, Alberta, on 160 acres of black soil that George's grandfather had broken with a horse team in 1919. The land was good land. Anyone who knew anything about that part of Alberta would tell you that. What the land had not been, in recent years, was particularly kind to the people trying to farm it. George Ellsworth died in October of 1987, 2 weeks after the first hard frost and 4 days before the crop insurance check arrived. He was 51 years old. He had a heart that the doctors had been watching for 3 years and a combine that needed a new rotor bearing and a line of credit at the credit union that he had never once missed a payment on. He left behind a wife, 2 adult children who had moved to Edmonton, and 160 acres that were paid for. Barely, but paid for. Naomi Okafor Ellsworth was 43 years old when her husband died. But it was a dry July. She had grown up in Lloydminster, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father, and a mother who kept the books for 3 different farms along the highway. She had met George at a fall supper in 1968, married him in 1970, and spent the 17 years between then and his death learning, by necessity and by genuine interest, everything there was to know about running a farm. She was not a woman who made a show of what she knew. That was something her daughter Pamela noticed later. How Naomi had always let George be the one to talk at the grain elevator, to shake hands with the seed rep, to negotiate with the bank. Not because she didn't have opinions, but because she had learned early that a farm wife's opinions were most useful when they were delivered quietly, after dinner when nobody else was listening. After George died, there was no more after dinner. There was just Naomi and the farm and the decisions that needed making. Her son-in-law, a structural engineer from Edmonton named Barry, who meant well and knew it, drove out in November to help her think things through. He brought spreadsheets. He had printed them at his office on the large format printer, and he spread them across the kitchen table with the confidence of a man who has solved harder problems than this. The numbers, Barry explained carefully, did not favor continuing. The combine was aging. Fuel costs were going up. Land rent from the quarters section to the south, which George had been cultivating for a neighboring family, would not cover the mortgage payments on the equipment loan. Naomi could sell the land. Prices were reasonable, not spectacular, but reasonable. Or she could rent the whole operation to one of the bigger outfits moving through the county and collect a check every fall without getting her hands dirty. She listened to all of this. She poured Barry more coffee. She thanked him for driving out. After he left, she put his spreadsheets in the drawer beside the telephone and did not look at them again. What she did instead was spend December and January reading. Not farming magazines, though she read those too. She read the provincial agriculture bulletins going back 8 years. She read 2 books on canola agronomy that the county extension office had lent her. She read George's machinery manuals, some of which still had his handwriting in the margins. Small penciled notes like "check this in spring" or "doesn't match what dealer said." And she found, in reading those notes, something she recognized as the particular intelligence of a man who had learned things the hard way and written them down so he wouldn't have to learn them twice. By February, she had a plan. It was not Barry's plan. It was not the plan anyone around her was expecting. The center of it was grain drying. Vermilion and the surrounding area sits in a part of Alberta where the harvest window is narrow and the weather is not particularly interested in cooperating with farmers' schedules. A wet fall, and there had been 3 wet falls in the past 7 years, meant grain coming off the combine at moisture levels too high to store safely. High moisture grain spoils. Spoiled grain is worth nothing, or close to nothing. The solution was drying. Running the grain through a dryer that forces heated air through the kernel mass and brings the moisture down to safe storage levels. The problem was that proper commercial grain dryers cost money that Naomi did not have. A new continuous flow dryer from a dealer in Lloydminster was quoted to her at just over $32,000, which was not a number she could make work without going back to the credit union, and she had decided, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, that she was not going to the credit union with her hat in her hand until she had exhausted every other option. This was what she was thinking about. On that February morning, when she drove 40 minutes in the dark to the farm auction outside of Manville, the seized grain dryer she brought home on a borrowed flat deck was not, by any reasonable assessment, a grain dryer anymore. It was a steel vessel with good bones. The shell was sound, 16-gauge steel, no serious rust. The welds intact except for that one crooked leg. The auger could be freed with the right lubricant and some patience. The controls housing was empty but undamaged. What it was missing was a heat source. What Naomi had, sitting behind the machine shed, was a 1971 propane furnace that George had pulled out of the house when they upgraded the heating system in 1983. He had kept it because it ran perfectly, and he couldn't see throwing out something that ran perfectly. George was like that. The furnace had sat under a tarp for 4 years, connected to nothing, maintained by no one, the pilot light unlit. It was a different fuel system, a different pressure rating, a different ignition setup than what the dryer had been built for. None of that was a secret. Naomi knew it before she paid $65 for Lot 47. She also knew that her neighbor 3 kilometers east, a man named Clifford Bauer, who ran a welding shop out of his Quonset and had been farming since before Naomi was born, had once told George that the 2 machines could theoretically be mated if you were patient and you knew what you were looking for in the gas train. She drove over to Clifford's place. The first week of March, sat in his shop on a creaky stool and asked him to explain it to her from the beginning. He looked at her for a moment. Not unkindly, just appraising. "You sure you want to get into this?" he asked. "I'm sure I want to understand it," she said. "Whether I get into it depends on what you tell me," he told her. She took notes in the same small green notebook she used for her grocery lists. She came back the following Tuesday with questions that told Clifford she had spent the week in between actually thinking about what he'd said, not just waiting for someone to do the work for her. He found that he enjoyed explaining things to someone who listened the way Naomi listened. Completely, without interrupting, with the occasional nod that meant keep going, I'm following. By April, Clifford was coming over 2 evenings a week to work on the conversion with her. He did the welding. He would not let her do the welding, though she asked twice. "Not because you can't learn," he said, "because I'll do it faster, and I don't want to be here until midnight." She accepted this with good grace and focused on everything else: the gas train, fabrication, the thermocouple calibration, the electrical control panel that she wired herself from a schematic she'd requested from the Provincial Agriculture Engineering Office in Edmonton. The woman on the phone at that office had been surprised to receive the request. Most of the calls they got were from contractors and engineers. She told Naomi she'd mail it out that day. Clifford's wife, Marion, started bringing coffee over. On the evenings Clifford came to work. She would sit in the lawn chair near the shop door and watch and sometimes talk, and Naomi was glad of the company in a way she hadn't expected to be. The farm was very quiet in the evenings now. George had been a man who filled a space without trying to. The dryer ran for the first time on a Tuesday in late August. Naomi had timed the test run carefully. She had a load of high-moisture oats she'd set aside from a field she'd swathed early, before the crop was quite ready, specifically to have something to run through the machine at a controlled moisture level she'd measured and recorded. She wanted numbers. She wanted to know what the airflow was doing, what the temperature gradient looked like across the column, how the moisture was dropping per hour at different settings. Clifford stood back with his arms crossed and watched. Marion sat in her lawn chair with a thermos. Naomi ran the machine for 4 hours, taking readings every 30 minutes, writing everything down in the green notebook. When she was done, she stood looking at the numbers for a long time. The moisture had dropped from 21.4% to 14.1% in those 4 hours, using the propane at a consumption rate that worked out to roughly 0,037 cents per bushel. She had estimated 0,042 based on Clifford's experience with similar setups. The actual number was better. She did not say anything dramatic. She put the notebook in her jacket pocket. She said, "Well, that'll work." Clifford laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind you don't plan. "Naomi," he said, "you are something else." Marion raised her thermos in a small salute. What happened over the next 2 harvests is the part of this story that Naomi herself is least comfortable telling. Not because she's modest exactly. She is too practical for false modesty, but because she has always been suspicious of narratives that make things look cleaner than they were. Things were not clean. The fall of 1988 was wet. Not catastrophically wet, not the kind of wet that makes the evening news, but the slow, grinding wet of a prairie fall that just won't close. The canola came off at 16 to 18% moisture, too high for the elevator, too expensive to sell at the dockage they'd charge. Half the farmers in the county were either leaving crop in the field or selling at a significant discount and hoping next year would be better. Naomi put her crop through the dryer. Every load she ran down to 10%. Elevator standard, the kind of grain that earns a premium rather than a penalty. She dried 18,000 bushels over 6 weeks. She ran the dryer 7 days a week, sometimes through the night, getting up at 2 in the morning to check readings and adjust settings the way a person gets up to check on a sick child. She did not lose a single load to spoilage. She also did something that people talked about for years afterward, though she did not plan for it to be talked about. Her neighbor to the west, a third-generation farmer named Pete Gallagher, who had been struggling since his wife's illness 2 years prior, had drained most of their savings, came over in the second week of October. He had 9,000 bushels of wheat sitting in his bins at 17% moisture, and no way to move it. He had looked into renting dryer time from the co-op elevator in Lloydminster, which was the closest facility with capacity. But the waiting list was 6 weeks long, and the per bushel was going to eat most of what the price premium would gain him. He knocked on Naomi's door on a Sunday evening. He had his hat in his hands, literally. His cap, which he turned over and over without seeming to notice he was doing it. He asked if she might consider renting him time on her dryer. She didn't rent it to him. She dried his grain alongside hers, charged him her propane cost, plus a small amount for her time, and told him to pay her when he could. He paid her in December, in full, and he shook her hand at the door and didn't say much beyond thank you. But his eyes said something else, something that had more to do with keeping a farm in the family than any words would cover. 2 other farmers came to her before the end of October. Same situation, different particulars. She helped them too. By the time the snow came in November, Naomi Ellsworth had dried grain for 4 operations, including her own, at a total propane cost she had tracked to the dollar. She had covered her auction purchase, the $65 for lot 47, somewhere in the first hour of the first test run. She had covered Clifford's labor in the first week of the actual harvest. Everything after that was margin. She did not take out a loan that fall. She did not the fall after that either. Barry came out again at Christmas with Pamela and the kids. He was a decent man and a good father. And Naomi genuinely liked him, which is why she didn't point out that his spreadsheets from the previous November were still in the drawer beside the telephone, unlooked at. He walked around the dryer setup in the yard while the kids were inside with Pamela. And he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. He looked at the welded connections, the control panel in its weatherproof housing, the modified gas train with its new fittings, and the careful bead of Clifford's welding holding everything where it needed to be. "You did this," he said. Not a question. "Clifford Bauer did the welding," Naomi said. "I did the rest." Barry was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "What made you think it was possible?" Naomi thought about this. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "I didn't think about whether it was possible," she said finally. "I thought about whether the parts were good and whether the principles were sound. The parts were good, the principles were sound. Everything else was just time and patience." Barry nodded. He looked at the machine a while longer. Something shifted in his face, some small recalibration, private and unremarked. "The kids want to see the shop," he said. "Tell them to put their boots on," Naomi said. There is a thing that happens sometimes in farming communities, a slow reckoning that doesn't announce itself. It happens over seasons rather than days. It happens in small conversations at the elevator, in comments at the church supper, in the way a person's name starts to be used in a certain way, as a reference point, a shorthand. By the fall of 1989, Naomi's name was being used that way around Vermilion. Not loudly. Not the way a name gets used in a newspaper story or a radio feature. Quietly, the way things get established in places where people are more interested in what works than in who gets credit. A crop agronomist from the county extension office came to see the setup. He came once, politely, and Naomi showed him everything. He came back 6 months later with a colleague from the provincial agriculture ministry who was working on a bulletin about low-cost, on-farm drying options for small and mid-size operations. She answered all their questions. She showed them her moisture logs and her propane consumption records and the notebook with her settings from the first test run. They used some of her numbers in the bulletin. Her name appeared in the acknowledgments section, which she found out about when her daughter mailed her a copy. Pamela had written across the top in marker, "Mom, you're famous." Naomi had put it on the refrigerator for a week and then moved it to a drawer. The farm equipment dealer, who had shaken his head at the auction, his name was Trent, and he ran a reputable operation and was not a bad man, stopped her at the Vermilion Co-op one afternoon in the spring of 1990. "I heard about your dryer," he said. She said. She was reading a label on a bag of seed treatment. "What you did with that gas train," Trent said, "that wasn't nothing." She looked up at him. "No," she said, "it wasn't." There was a pause. Trent nodded once, the specific nod of a man who is correcting something internally. "You ever want to talk about new equipment," he said, "come see me." "I'll do that," she said. She went back to reading the label. Trent walked away. In the particular grammar of that county, the exchange meant a great deal. The years after 1989 brought other challenges, as years always do on a farm. There was a bad hail. There was a bad hailstorm in 1991 that took 40% of the canola. There were 2 years in the mid-90s when commodity prices did things that made the provincial agriculture ministry produce a series of very serious bulletins. The combine that had needed a new rotor bearing when George died eventually needed more than a bearing, and the decision to repair versus replace was one that Naomi lay awake over for 3 nights before she made it. What those years did not bring was the slow dissolution that Barry's spreadsheets had predicted, the gradual erosion of margin until the math made selling the only sensible choice. Part of that was the dryer, which continued to serve her own operation and several neighboring farms for 11 years before a flood in the spring of 1998 undermined one of the pad footings, and she decided the repair costs were not worth it at that point. She replaced it with a proper commercial unit, paid for in cash, from Trent's dealership. Trent gave her a good price. She expected he would. But the dryer was not all of it. The dryer was a piece of equipment. What it had demonstrated, to Naomi, as much as to anyone watching, was a way of seeing a habit that didn't begin with the question, "What can I afford?" but with the question, "What do I need, and what will actually do the job?" George had had a version of this. His penciled notes in the margins of the machinery manuals were evidence of it. The constant, quiet evaluation of what the dealer said against what the machine actually did. What Naomi had done in those 2 years after his death was locate the same habit in herself. She had always had it. She had just needed circumstances to require it. Her daughter Pamela understood this clearly by the mid-90s, though she'd had her doubts in 1987. Her son Marcus, who lived in Vancouver and worked in commercial real estate, took longer. He came to visit in the summer of 1995, the first time he'd been back in 3 years, and walked the farm with his mother on a dry July evening, the fields stretching out gold and green in the long prairie light. He asked her at some point, carefully, the way you ask someone you love a question you're not sure you should, whether she had ever thought about what her life might have looked like if she hadn't stayed, if she'd sold in 1987 and done something else. Naomi thought about this. She walked for a bit without answering. "I think about what I have," she said. I don't spend much time on what I might have had. There isn't enough of the day." Marcus was quiet. They walked past the site where the old dryer had sat before the flood. There was nothing left of it now but a concrete pad and a discoloration in the soil. "Did you know it was going to work?" he asked. "When you bought that thing at the auction, did you actually know?" "I knew the principles were sound," she said. "I knew what I paid for it, and I knew what the upside was. The rest was just doing the work and seeing." Marcus nodded. He looked out at the fields his grandfather's grandfather had broken with horses in the year before the First World War. "Barry always said you were the sharpest person in any room you walked into," he said. "He said he figured that out the first Christmas." Naomi smiled. It was a small, private smile, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. "Barry is a good man," she said. "The farm is still in the family. Naomi is in her late 70s now, and the day-to-day operation has passed to a younger generation. But she is still there every morning at the kitchen table, with her coffee and her record books, still tracking the numbers the way she has tracked them since 1987, still writing things down in green notebooks. She buys 12 at a time from the stationery supply in Lloydminster. There are farmers in the Vermilion area. Some of them, her neighbors' children, some of them, people who came into the county long after 1988, who refer to her the way you refer to someone whose particular combination of intelligence and stubbornness and patience has become a kind of local landmark. The extension office that helped her in 1989 invited her to speak at an agricultural conference in 2003. She declined. She sent a letter that was, by all accounts, the most useful part of the conference anyway. Clifford Bauer died in 2009. Marion sent Naomi a note that said, among other things, that Clifford had talked about those Tuesday evenings in the shop until the end. Not the specific work, but the quality of the company. Naomi drove to the funeral in Manville and sat in the third pew and did not make a speech. She brought Marion a covered dish that Marion told Pamela was the best thing anyone brought to the house that week. The green notebook from the summer of 1988, the test-run notebook. But it was a dry July with the moisture readings every 30 minutes and the propane consumption figures and the temperature gradients and the small note at the bottom of the last page that says simply 14.1%. Good enough is in the top drawer of the filing cabinet in the farm office. The handwriting in it is the same handwriting as the grocery lists from that year. The same hand that picked up the phone to call the extension office in Edmonton and asked for the schematic. The same hand that raised itself at a February auction in Manville for a machine nobody else wanted. $65 she paid. And everything after that was just the work.